If you would have told me that 35 chapters after Wano ended, we would be getting a chapter titled Luffy vs. Kizaru, I would have thought you were literally insane, but here we are. And I will say, despite the chapter title, it felt a lot more like a setup chapter for 1094 than one that really deserved that title, to me at least, but there still is quite a bit of interesting stuff to cover, including what we did see from their fight in this chapter. But just like last week, I actually want to start by talking about what we saw at the end of the chapter, where Saturn almost looks like he's sleeping, while Atlas is calling out new orders to the Mark III pacifistas. This is an interesting inversion to the ancient robot who woke up during the last chapter, although we didn't see that robot in this chapter, unfortunately. Now, I'm not saying that Saturn and this robot are connected necessarily, since one's sleeping and one's awake, but rather it's just interesting that Oda drew it that way. We were talking after my live stream about the chance for this to potentially connect to the shadow that we saw back in chapter 1075. This is still an unsolved mystery, and I've mentioned in a few videos on the main channel now that I think this could actually be Saturn, with the main reason originally being that it's roughly a silhouette of him as it is, although it's a little obscured. However, later on in chapter 1085, we saw that Emu has some kind of shadow-esque powers, and even the Gorosei transformed into these big shadowy creatures, which very well could be silhouettes for zone fruits or something like that. But the point is just that Oda has kind of tied the top brass of the government to shadows even after this happened on Egghead. Now, fair warning, some of this theory that I'm about to say is a little bit tinfoily, but I think we may have actually stumbled upon something during my live reaction to the chapter. And I'll throw some comments on screen from those people who helped shape this idea during the stream, which you can find down below. But if we assume for just a moment that it was really Saturn's shadow at Egghead in chapter 1075, then maybe the reason he's sleeping is because he's about to send the shadow back over now that the pacifista have swapped sides again. He may not be able to control both his body and his shadow simultaneously, which we saw Moria could do during Thriller Bark with his shadow fruit. So that may be an important distinction, like the fruit lets you control both, but if you have the right technique or hockey or whatever it is, maybe you can still use your shadow in other ways without the fruit. So maybe Saturn may need to fall asleep and almost astral project his shadow while he's sleeping, and he may not wake back up until the shadow returns to him. This would be pretty similar to Brook in his soul form, where his body kinda goes limp when he sends out his soul. However, he's able to travel through walls and venture pretty far away from his body. If Saturn is truly able to control his shadow, then maybe it's a similar process, and thus why it looks like he's asleep at the end of chapter 1093, meaning we will get to see the shadow form sometime in chapter 1094 maybe, or 1095, which would be a pretty fun mix with Kizaru and his light abilities right now versus Luffy. Which, like I said, this fight is awesome, but it didn't feel like in this chapter that it went far enough to deserve that chapter title just yet, at least to me. But regardless, the art is top notch. I've been saying this in pretty much every reaction so far, but ever since Kizaru pulled up, the art on Egghead has gone next level, and that's pretty much because of his light powers. It gives a lot of opportunity for Oda to go ham on the shading, and he definitely hasn't skipped any of those opportunities. And despite the overall seriousness of their battle, since these are two of the strongest people that we've ever seen face off, Gear 5 Luffy and Kizaru are two of the most unserious people, personality-wise, in the entire story. I loved how Kizaru didn't even bother stopping himself till right before he went into the ocean, just to immediately get back to Egghead at the speed of light, basically. He probably could have stopped whenever he wanted, but you know how he is. But we also see him use the Yasakani no Magatama to turn into a bunch of shadow clones, essentially. We've seen him use that attack a bunch of times before, like at the end of Marineford, for example, but we've never seen him use the shadow clone thing before, which is really interesting. And it is pretty ironic that the guy with the light powers is making shadow clones, or at least what we traditionally call shadow clones, and it would be pretty ironic as well if Saturn can actually control his shadow. And while it wasn't outright stated in the chapter, I wonder if what we're seeing here from Kizaru is one of his applications of a logia awakening, or some kind of midway point potentially, like a technique that logias have to actually practice substantially in order to use, maybe somewhat like Luffy using his prior gears before actually getting gear 5th or something. It may not be awakening, but it's something you still don't get right away. You have to train for it, maybe. Because I gotta tell ya, imagining Akainu and Aokiji doing this kind of thing all across Punk Hazard has me pretty hyped. I mean, imagine as Marine Admirals vying for Fleet Admiral, they use their powers to create their own massive armies of themselves to duke it out to earn the right to control the real massive army, being the Marines. Creating your own army with your Devil Fruit would kind of be on the level of Awakening, to me at least. Independent shadow clones made of your own Logia element would just be pretty OP. Ever since seeing the aftermath of Punk Hazard, it's been theorized pretty commonly that Logia Awakenings permanently change the environment, which is still totally on the table, but what we saw from Kizaru has me thinking that Oda has some other plans up his sleeve as well. Even if this isn't Awakening, we should be probably hyped for what Logias will be able to do. Now, like I said, it It wasn't confirmed that this was awakening, and I'm a big believer that unless Oda tells us, we shouldn't assume it, kind of like with Big Mom and Kaido, who I definitely don't think are awakened yet, because Doflamingo, Katakuri, Luffy, Kid, and Law all said it was their awakening very clearly when they used it, and even Crocodile told us about the Jailer Beast of Impel Down. Obviously Kaku and Lucci were revealed as awakened as well during Egghead, so unless it's stated outright, I don't think it's safe to assume that's the case, but maybe in 1094 it'll come up in discussion, because Vegapunk almost has to know what Logia awakenings do, especially Kizaru's because of their connection, so I could definitely see him bring it up at some point while they're riding away in the Vega tank. Like maybe he says something like, if this fight goes on much longer, Kizaru might use his awakening and then we're all gonna lose, or something like that, just to hype up how strong the awakening could be. But now let's talk about Vegapunk, because he decided to go help Bonnie, which ironically ended up saving him because Kizaru got back into the control room. And when Vegapunk was riding out in the Vega tank, he also said that I'll be damned if I stand by while a little girl gets murdered. And that's kind of ominous to me because Saturn said something kind of similar just a few chapters ago, where he said that they could spare Bonnie because she was just a little girl. I think it was kind of easy to dismiss it early on when Saturn first said it, because it was kind of a throwaway thing and he could be like 800 years old, so of course Bonnie will be like a little girl to him. But now that Vegapunk said it, who is still old of course, but he also knows Bonnie very well because of his ties to Kuma, my eyebrows are definitely raised. Could this potentially be a hint that Bonnie isn't as old as we think she is? Like maybe her real age is a lot younger than this? Whatever the truth of that is will probably come to light as soon as Kuma gets to Egghead, which I feel like is pretty likely to happen soon after what we saw in chapter 1092. Now the fact that we have Bonnie outside the Labostratum, Vegapunk headed there, Kizaru was just looking at them but lit up Luffy like a true sun god, I guess, and now Saturn might be using some astral projection nonsense to send his shadow there, that all tells me that something big is gonna go down in the main part of this lab. Kuma might pull up there as well, since that's kind of like the entrance, I guess. We're still waiting for the Blackbeard pirates to make their move, which that could happen there potentially, and everything is just kind of set up to pop off in chapter 1094, which is sort of what I meant earlier when I said that this chapter felt kind of more like a setup chapter than really delivering on the Luffy versus Kizaru thing. I'm also extremely confused what's going on with Zoro and Lucci right now, and I know this might be kind of an unpopular opinion, I don't really know, maybe it's just me, but I am really surprised at how much Oda's utilizing Lucci during this arc. He's had his paws all over this thing, no pun intended, by first fighting Luffy originally, then getting taken out by Stussy, then teaming up with our crew to fight the Seraphim, then apparently we took our eye off him for 2 seconds because he leaked intel to the government, and he tried to take out Vegapunk but got Stussy instead, and now he's awakened again in fighting Zoro. I think it's just a lot of action for someone we've already beaten before and got a lot of focus in Eni's lobby, and then also the flip-flopping of sides, and the fact we let him share that intel despite how sus we have to know he is, it kinda has me a little Lucci'd out, I guess. Lucci's a great character, it's just he's doing a lot in Egghead, that's all. And I thought after last chapter that Sanji and Zoro would just team up to get Lucci into a bubble and then that would be it for him pretty much, but that doesn't seem to be what's happening here, so I have no idea what's gonna happen. And now I did enjoy Zoro talking shit for a little bit with Lucci, but like in general, he's just been involved quite a bit. Another interesting thing that I want to point out though is that we saw the Vega tank 8, and we know Vegapunk has 6 separate satellites, so it's like he skipped the number 7 basically. And I mentioned in my Elbaf video how Eustace Kid has 07 on the side of his railgun that he calls damned punk. Oda definitely has some connection cooking up between him and Vegapunk, but I just don't know what it is quite yet. Kid was seen with a wrench kind of building things as a child, and Vegapunk has obviously been about that life since like day 1, and with the punk connection and this 07 thing, there has to be something going on. But as for predictions for future chapters, I'll just say that we still need to see the Blackbeard pirates. There was this fun exchange between some of us in the Discord, which you can find a link for down below. It all started with Muglatan, who has his own channel, but then Kuya, Saran Wrap, and Michael Evans also added to it, but it was originally about Catarina Devon potentially transforming into Saturn to then give orders to the Pacifista and the Seraphim. And while that is totally down the Blackbeard pirates alley, there are some definite obstacles. For example, Saturn could just override those orders since he himself is right off the shore of Egghead, but also Mr. 2 also had cloning powers obviously, although they were a little bit different, and he had to touch someone first in order to transform into them. So Catarina Devon could have some kind of similar limitation for all we know, but I think there's actually a way around both of those that ties to the theory I brought up earlier in the chapter. If Saturn really does fall asleep or whatever to separate his shadow from his body, then that could be the prime opportunity to not only go onto his ship to touch his face so that she can transform into him, but also take his body hostage or something. Remember in Thriller Bark how people were out cold for a while after having their shadows removed, and their bodies kind of got taken hostage, but kind of in a reverse way where they would go take them onto their own ship. Well, Saturn could be in that same kind of state right now, and maybe he doesn't return to normal until his shadow returns. So if the Blackbeard pirates do get there after his body is separated, maybe they can go take his body, sail away, and then they're permanently separated, and Devon can almost assume his position. Imagine Lafitte and Devon go onto his ship, Devon transforms into him, then Lafitte takes the body back to Hachinosu or something, because Saturn can't do anything while his shadow is over on Egghead or whatever, so then everyone just thinks that Devon is actually Saturn since she would be in the proper place. She would look just like him and be on the ship where he just was. Lafitte was able to sneak into the Warlord meeting in the pre-time skip, and many of us predict that he and Devon are the ones here at Egghead right now. So this would be almost like a level up to that whole espionage thing by leaking into the world government, I guess. I know it's kind of tinfoily, but Blackbeard has something planned here, I can guarantee you that. But that's all for this video. Please hit like and subscribe if you enjoyed it, but until next time, later.